When I was first making the switch to software engineering, I had no clue what to expect from the interview process. I didn't know what questions I'd be asked, what the various stages would be, or what they would expect of me. Now, over 30 interviews later, I'll reveal the answer to every single one of those questions. I'll cover every single step of the interview process, starting from the 3 most common online assessment platforms, how to strategically approach recruiter calls, my secret to passing any behavioral interview, and what hiring managers are actually looking for in the dreaded technical interview. By the end, you'll know exactly what you can expect from application to offer in your next software engineering interview. Hey everyone, my name is Mark Benliyan, and within 18 months of learning to code, I did 6 software engineering internships at companies like Figma, Netflix, NASA, and Tinder. And on this channel, my goal is to help other students land their dream software engineering jobs. So if you've been able to champion your way through the never-ending list of rejection emails and actually get a response from a company, then chances are that first step will be an online assessment. These usually come in the form of online tests where you'll have a series of coding problems for you to solve. And there'll typically be a set of test cases that each of your answers have to sort of pass. And in the end, companies will receive a final score that sort of measures how well did you do on that assessment. And based on that score and how it fits into their hiring bar, they'll determine whether or not they want to move forward and actually interview you. So there are 3 core online assessment platforms that you should be familiar with. The first one is Byteboard, and this is used by companies like Figma and Lyft. Next up, we have the Code Signal, which has been sent to me from companies like Netflix and Tinder. And finally, we have the HackerRank assessment, which has been used by companies like Amazon and Slack. So the Byteboard is by far my favorite assessment style, and it's actually been growing in popularity recently. The Byteboard is designed to feel like it's a day in the life of an engineer. I've taken this Byteboard assessment on 2 separate occasions, and each of them have contained 2 parts. First, I've had a 40-minute technical design exercise, and this involves no coding. In fact, you'll actually get like a project spec that sort of outlines various details about a mock project that the team is trying to take on. And there'll be different comments, things that are like asked to you for clarification, and you'll also go through sort of like a Google Docs and leave your own opinions on what things you want clarity on, or what things you feel like we should look out for, or how we can improve. And in the end of that section, they'll usually outline 2 to 3 different approaches you can take to solve the given problem, and they'll ask for you to respond with which one you think is the best approach. It's important to note that in this section of the online assessment, there isn't really a right or wrong answer, and it's more about, are you properly weighing the trade-offs of each approach? And the second half has been like a 70-minute coding implementation exercise. This is different than the typical algorithmic style interviews you might see, let's say like on LeetCode, but instead you have an online coding environment provided to you where there's like multiple different files with predefined classes and functions, and you'll typically be implementing some smaller portion of the project that you were working on in the first section. Next up is the Code Signal, which is actually my least favorite assessment platform. 90% of the time when you're invited to take a Code Signal, you'll be invited to something called a general Code Signal exam, which will be 70 minutes to solve 4 coding problems. These will be your typical LeetCode style algorithm problems, where questions 1 and 2 will typically be easy problems, and questions 3 and 4 can be medium or hard. And in the end, you'll get a cumulative score based on how well you did. In the past, this cumulative score would range from 600 to 850, but as of spring 2023, CodeSignal has actually changed their scoring algorithm, so now it's actually from 200 to 600 being the perfect score. Another note about these code signals is that these exams are actually proctored, so you'll have your camera on during the entire assessment. And this is one of the things that make it unique compared to the Byteboard or HackerRank, which neither of them involve you having your camera on. Another small quirk about code signals is when you actually get invited to do this general code signal, you can only do one of those every 14 days. So for example, if Netflix and Tinder both reach out to you on the same day and invite you to a code signal, you'll have 2 weeks to complete it. But the thing is, you'll only be able to complete one of the assessments, and you'll actually send that same score to both of the companies, which has its pros and cons, because if you do one code signal really well, you're typically able to ride that wave for quite some time. I think the threshold is up to 6 months. But on the flip side, it can get pretty annoying that you're not constantly able to retake one of these tests. Finally, we have the HackerRank assessment. This is sort of like the default online assessment that comes to my mind when I think of these types of things. And for what it's worth, HackerRank does also mention that an ideal test should have both a simple and an advanced problem, where the simple problem 80% of applicants should be able to solve, and the advanced problem only 20% of applicants should be able to solve. To be honest though, I'm not entirely convinced that that's been true in my own experience, but make of that what you will. So the last thing I'll touch on is that some of these companies actually automatically send out online assessments to every single applicant, and only after receiving the score do they conduct the resume screen. One example of this in the past has been a quant trading firm called Citadel. So essentially what happens is that basically everyone who applies to Citadel receives Citadel's online assessment. Then you as the applicant now spend over an hour taking this online assessment, and even if you get a perfect score, Citadel might just follow up with you and reject you anyway.
What?
And this is because your resume never met their hiring bar in the first place, but they never sort of bothered to check before they sent you the online assessment. And this is in no way to bash Citadel specifically. There's a ton of companies who kind of do this sort of thing. This can kind of give you a leg up where sometimes a less experienced resume can actually make its way through the interview process because they had a really high online assessment score. So the main takeaway is just don't get disheartened if you get a perfect score on an online assessment and get rejected anyway. It's likely one of those companies that I was just speaking about. All right, so after you complete the online assessment, the next step will likely be a recruiter screen. This is usually a chill behavioral chat over the phone that lasts anywhere from like 15 to 30 minutes. In this call, the recruiter might ask you some pretty common questions like why are you interested in that company or that role in particular, or maybe even what you're looking for in your next opportunity. But it's important to note that this call will almost never be technical. You're not going to be grilled on things on your resume or told to solve any coding problems. It's also a great opportunity for recruiters to sort of clarify anything that they need to make sure with you, like do you require visa sponsorship, or are you open to relocation if they have an in-person role, and also things like what you can expect in the interview process. For the most part, you shouldn't overthink or stress this interview. Do some basic research on the company or role and come prepared with maybe a couple questions that you're wanting to ask the recruiter, but otherwise just be yourself and I'm sure you'll do fine. This typically isn't the stage where a ton of candidates are getting screened out. So after the recruiter screen, the next thing you'll run into is the behavioral interview. Behavioral interviews allow employers to assess a candidate's non-technical abilities, and they're important for three core reasons. First, they help you determine if a candidate would be a good fit within the company's culture. They also help screen for various traits like effective communication, good problem solving, and just how you work in teams. The final and most crucial part of the behavioral interview is in a lot of these software engineering interviews, this is actually the only time where a candidate speaks about their past experiences. And as you can imagine, that's actually really important for the hiring manager to sort of know about what have you done in the past. And there's a common trend I see among software engineers where they really underplay the importance of the behavioral interview, and in my opinion, that's a huge mistake. I used to do the same thing where I was so convinced that as long as I passed the technical interview, the behavioral doesn't even matter, right? But that's really far from the truth, and especially in a competitive landscape like we're in today, it's becoming increasingly more popular where final hiring decisions are actually made from these behavioral interviews. All right, so Amazon actually has a really helpful resource for interview prep, and one of the things they cover are example behavioral questions that you can expect to be asked. So one example of this is when did you take a risk, make a mistake, or fail? And they can ask follow-up questions like how did you respond to it, or how did you grow from that experience? Or another question could be like describe a time you took the lead on a project. As you may already be able to tell, a lot of the answers to these behavioral questions come in the form of stories, which is exactly why there's a really popular storytelling framework for how to shape some of these behavioral answers called the STAR framework. The S stands for situation, which is essentially saying that before you approach the story that you're going to tell, really lay out the groundwork of what does someone need to know, what kind of context, what situation were you in to actually understand the rest of the story you're going to tell them. Next up we have T, which stands for task. So what was the goal you had in mind? Let's say if it was describing a project you took the lead on, what was the goal of that project? Next is action. You want to be really specific and concise with the actions that you took to accomplish your goal. One of the things that's really crucial here is you want to use I instead of we. Interviewers are really looking for things that you have personally done. And one of the common mistakes, for lack of a better term, that I see people make is kind of like they're less confident in the things that they did. And so they just use we to sort of soften the blow in some way, but you shouldn't do that. Finally, we have R, which stands for result. And this is essentially saying, what was the outcome of what you did? Did you accomplish your goal? How did that go? Do you have any sort of metrics to sort of show how well it went? And so on. So let's drive this home with a personal example using one of Amazon's example questions and one of my personal experiences. So say I was asked to describe a time I took a lead on a project. When I was an intern at Figma, I came across a project that had been initiated at a previous company-wide hackathon. The project aimed to introduce a type ahead emoji feature to both Figma and FigJam, which was a highly requested feature by users. Task. While the foundational work had been started by some of my teammates before I actually joined the company, There was still a lot of work to be done, and there wasn't yet a clear path to completion. I was responsible for taking the lead on this feature, figuring out what else needs to be done, and shipping it out to users. I began by gathering all of the work that had been done during the previous hackathon to really understand the state of this project. I then organized a meeting with our key stakeholders, including my manager, our product manager, and also the product designer for the project. And in this meeting, we really just clarified the project's goals and any challenges we anticipated facing along the way. I also scheduled some one-on-ones with the engineers that had done the foundational work before me to kind of pick their brain about a few things. At this point, I had a clear plan in place and set some milestones to always sort of make sure I'm on track. I also worked really closely with the design team to make sure that this met Figma's really high bar of design standard and sort of like the company's branding as a whole. Result: by the end of my internship, I was able to complete and successfully launch this type ahead emoji feature to both Figma and FigJack. The feature was really well received by users, and this was something that people had been asking for a really long time, so they were happy to see it fleshed out. It significantly improved the speed and ease with which users were able to actually use emojis on the platform, and overall helped enhance the functionality for the design process. And the important takeaway there is that you sort of want to break up what you're saying into these categories that really help the interviewer sort of follow along and relive the experience with you. The next step of the interview process is the technical interview. This is the first time where you'll encounter some live coding challenge. Most times, these are the sorts of problems that you'll run into on a website like LeetCode or earlier in one of your online assessments that you submitted. Except the only difference is that this time, you'll be coding the problem live and collaborating with your interviewer, a fellow engineer. One of the core things here is that you want to speak out loud about your thought process. So an example question you might run into is, let's say, two-sum, which is the most popular question on LeetCode. Here, the interviewer will be testing your knowledge of data structures and algorithms, and sort of if you're able to kind of come up with the most efficient solution for the problem. In the context of these interviews, an efficient solution is sort of measured by this thing called Big O notation, which is essentially the language we use to talk about how long an algorithm takes to run, which is its time complexity, and how much memory is used by an algorithm, which is called its space complexity. And look, if you're not familiar at all with this Big O notation stuff, or maybe you've never even seen LeetCode or something like a two-sum problem, don't worry. There are a ton of resources out there online and even on YouTube that'll introduce you to these concepts. So for now, just take this as a high-level overview to kind of synthesize all the information in your mind on what you can expect. And then you can dive deeper into the parts that you feel least prepared for. So the goal of these live coding interviews is actually to feel out how you think and what it's like to sort of collaborate with you on a problem. Generally, the best way to approach interviews like this is to take a few moments after you get the problem to really think about what your approach is going to be. What you don't want to do is jump right into coding. Instead, walk your interviewer through your thought process and how you're thinking about the problem. Even if there's a portion that you don't understand, just tell them that. You can be like, this specific section of the problem is kind of giving me some trouble. I'm not yet sure how we're going to solve that, but I'm still thinking through it. And look, it's okay if your solution isn't perfect yet. The goal really is to just be able to guide your interviewer through whatever your thought process is, not having the most perfect thought process possible. And this is a trend that you want to keep up throughout the rest of the interview. This isn't just in the first 5 minutes. Typically, a good rule of thumb is that every line of code you write, you want to have somewhat explained to the interviewer. Alright, so another type of technical interview that exists is called the system design interview. As a disclaimer, this isn't needed for nearly all internship roles, but Netflix is one of the few companies that did ask me system design in my interview process. Though to be fair, they did make sort of like a simplified intern version of the system design interview. So one example of a system design question that Amazon used to ask in their interview processes is design the Uber app. And so you as the candidate would now be responsible for first kind of thinking about what are all of the core things that you're going to need to account for. So these could be things like a user needs to be able to accept the ride. You need to have a way of determining which sort of driver you give the ride to. You need to be able to process payments. You'll probably have some kind of basic security protocols and so on. A recurring theme of these technical interviews is that you want to think out loud. The interviewer wants to know why you made every decision that you made and the thought pattern that brought you to that conclusion. These are again the types of interviews where there isn't just one right answer for how to design a system like that. So the more important thing to index on is being able to explain or justify the decisions that you're making. And another bit of advice that I actually got from one of my Amazon recruiters is if your interviewer is giving you sort of any bits of advice in these technical interviews, definitely be sure to take that well and incorporate it into what you're doing. It's very common in the debriefs that'll happen after you're done with your interviewers for the engineers to kind of recap, did Mark take feedback well? And those little instances of them kind of giving you a hint or kind of nudging you in a certain direction are going to be the times that they reflect on. So I'm not yet a senior software engineer, and I do know that as you kind of climb the ranks, that these system design rounds can get increasingly complex. But some of the ones that I've run into at this intern and new grad level have been more like getting a predefined set of APIs and being asked some kind of problem where your job is to kind of piece together these APIs and see how they would work in a larger system. And just like the coding interviews, again, there's a ton of resources out there on the system design interview, which I would absolutely recommend you check out. And that's really the entire gist of the technical interviews, whether they're a coding challenge or a system design round. And most software engineering interview processes will be some combination of the 4 components that we discussed. So now if you're watching this and feeling like, Mark, I'm really ready to start sending out my applications, I'm excited and I want to get into the interview processes, I recommend you watch this video on the best strategy for going about applying to jobs and increasing the amount of interviews you get invited to. I'll see you in the next one.